Despite the Allied bombing campaign, production of the 109 seems to have remained at a fairly constant level. Indeed, production at Messerschmitt's Regensburg factory did not peak until October 1944, when it was turning out some 25 aircraft a day. Incredibly, in the first months of 1945, and with defeat looming, Germany's aircraft industry still managed to produce 2,969 109s, of which just over 1,000 were produced at Regensburg. The 109 was exported to a number of countries, and in Spain, they continued in service after the war. Renamed Bucon, these 109s were paradoxically powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin. When war broke out in 1939, the Luftwaffe was the only air force in the world to have faced up to the problem of developing an escort fighter with the range to accompany bomber attacks. The Messerschmitt Bf 110 was designed as a heavy fighter, but with the capability of being deployed as a high-speed bomber. It was argued that its heavy firepower and speed would compensate for poorer handling when confronted by a more agile single-engine fighter. Eventually powered by two Daimler-Benz 601 engines, the 110 should have been a great success. But it is now generally regarded as a failure. Its poor acceleration and wide turning circle meant that it was no match for the RAF Spitfires. This led to the farcical situation of the already hard-pressed 109s having to provide escort for the escorting 110s as well. It was only later in the war, when, as a night fighter, that the 110 began to fulfill its potential. RAF bomber crews came to dread the prospect of a radar-equipped 110 creeping up from below and behind, unseen in the dark, before opening fire with its 4 machine guns and 2 cannon at close range. The 110 first flew in May 1936, but a shortage of the Daimler-Benz 601 engine meant that the early types had to make do with the less powerful Junkers Jumo engine. But by the spring of 1939, the first of the new C variants powered by the Daimler-Benz engines began arriving in operational units. The fuel-injected 601s gave the 110 a top speed of 349 miles per hour at around 23,000 feet. Its range was about 500 miles, depending on loaded weight and the weather. As well as the 2 wing-mounted cannons and 4 machine guns in the nose, there was a rear-facing machine gun at the end of a long greenhouse-type cockpit. During the invasion of Poland, the 110 performed well. Its reputation was further enhanced when 110s shot down 9 out of 22 Vickers Wellington bombers during a raid on Heligoland Bight in December 1939. Encouraged by these successes, 110 production was stepped up so that by 1940 an average of 102 aircraft a month were rolling off the production lines. Again, as the German Blitzkrieg swept through Holland, Belgium and France, the 110 performed well, turning to ground attack work once it had seen off the enemy aircraft. But as the Battle of Britain began to unfold, the 110's shortcoming began to become glaringly apparent. It was no match for the agile Spitfires and Hurricanes of RAF Fighter Command, and as losses mounted, so Messerschmitt 109s were also tasked with escorting their stablemates. But the 110 could stay with the bombers for longer, and so the D version was developed, which did away with the cannon so that it could carry more fuel, extending its range still further. More versions followed as the Daimler-Benz 601 was developed, so that by the time the G version entered service, power had increased from around 1,000 horsepower to 1,475 horsepower. By then, the cannon had also returned, as the 110 was being increasingly redeployed as a night fighter, and it needed heavy firepower to knock down the RAF's bombers. Some 110s were equipped with guns that fired directly upwards into the belly of the bomber. As the Germans developed their radar capability, a third crew member was added to operate the Liechtenstein air interception radar system. During the Russian campaign, which began in June 1941, the 110 earned a good reputation as a fighter bomber. The combination of heavy forward-firing firepower and bombs carried on hardpoints under the wings meant that the 110 could provide invaluable support to the ground forces as they advanced across the vast expanse of Russia. What's more, its endurance enabled 110s to loiter over the battlefield, searching for targets of opportunity or responding to calls for help from the ground. Fortunately, the Russians were still some way off from having any effective fighter defences, and so the 110's success in the ground attack role gave the type a new lease of life. But in 1942, Germany faced a new threat from the US Army Air Force. While the RAF attacked by night, the US 8th Air Force attacked by day. Their first raids had been relatively short-distance flights to hit targets in France, but as the war progressed, larger attacks were mounted deeper into Germany against industrial targets. The Messerschmitt 110 was now redeployed in the air defence role. Initially, its formidable firepower was effective at tearing apart the bomber streams. But as the Allies began introducing long-range escort fighters like the P-51 Mustang, the 110 found itself hopelessly outclassed again. The 110's lack of maneuverability meant that it was no match for the fast, agile P-51s, and so they were shot down in droves. By the time production ceased in March 1945, a total of just over 6,000 110s had been built. The early successes of the 110 fueled the Luftwaffe's enthusiasm for a design that was planned as the 110's successor. But the Bf-210 was a complete failure and cost Willy Messerschmitt his position at the head of the company that bore his name. The Bf-210 looked very advanced and sleek when it first flew in September 1939. But in the air, it proved to be very unstable and difficult to handle. A frantic program of modifications followed, but even these could not get rid of a tendency to stall and spin. The Tu-10 was conceived as a twin-engined, multi-purpose fighter and attack aircraft. Its specification looked so impressive on paper that the Luftwaffe ordered 1,000 machines before the type had even flown. But many of its problems stemmed from trying to build in too many new ideas into an untried airframe. For example, the 13mm machine guns were mounted in electronically controlled barbettes on either side of the fuselage. Aiming was all but impossible, and the mechanical complexity meant that they often failed. As a result, crews rarely used them. The forward section housed a bay designed to carry photo reconnaissance equipment or two 1,100-pound bombs. But the clam-type bomb bay doors made the aircraft so unstable when opened that only a crew bent on self-destruction would dare open them in flight. The Tu-10 also featured a complex arrangement of ailerons, flaps and dive brakes. Although these were intended to help the pilot, they only served to make the Tu-10 even more unstable. When used, they had a tendency to flick the aircraft into an uncontrollable spin. Although repeated attempts were made to try and resolve the Tu-10's vices, production had to be temporarily suspended in 1942. Many of the problems were solved by lengthening the rear fuselage and adding automatic slats to the wing's leading edge. This modified aircraft was redesignated the 410 Hornisse or Hornet and was delivered to the Luftwaffe from January 1943. Both aircraft looked almost identical and used the Daimler-Benz 603 12-cylinder inline engine. These engines gave the 410 a top speed of 364 miles per hour at around 22,000 feet and a maximum service ceiling of just over 32,000 feet. As well as the rearwards firing machine guns, the 410 had four 20mm cannon and two machine guns firing forwards. As the Allies stepped up their bombing campaign in 1944, the 410s were engaged in the home defence role. But during raids on southern England later that year, they proved their value as a ground attack aircraft by both day and night. But the type was, in reality, little better than the later developments of the Bf 110, which it was intended to replace. And so, in September 1944, production was terminated after just over 1,000 aircraft had been built. The Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet was the only rocket-powered aircraft, not including aircraft developed for the kamikaze role, to see action during the Second World War. This remarkable little aircraft was developed from the designs of Dr. Alexander Lippisch, whose team had joined Messerschmitt in January 1939. They began work by adapting a tailless research glider to take a Volta rocket motor. This produced 882 pounds of thrust, which propelled the test aircraft at up to 342 miles per hour. The rocket used a liquid fuel made up of hydrogen peroxide, methyl alcohol, and water. Unfortunately, the mixture was highly unstable, and several aircraft exploded on landing. It was found that the unburnt fuel was igniting spontaneously due to the vibration. Another problem that plagued the comet's development was a fuel leak, which could quite literally dissolve the pilot like an acid bath. Because there was no room for an undercarriage, takeoff relied on a jettisonable wheeled dolly system.